Tonight, hold on to something. Tim Burton's made a good one. Welcome to a spooky Macclevoid at the movies. Hello, I'm Dr. Macclevoid. No, it's not my real name. Let's just get that out of the way. So, Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice. No, I forget the rest of the quote, but you remember it, don't you? The 1988 movie. Now it's got a sequel, ridiculously, in 2024. We haven't waited for it. We didn't ask for it. There might have been some residual interest of having one sometime, in 1988, 89, but it didn't happen. Tim Burton went on and he did other things. He made Batman and Edward Scissorhands and Batman Again. Wasn't that what it was called? Didn't return to the world of Beetlejuice. There was going to be a sequel called Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian. Never happened. I'd like to have seen Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian. Doing a Beetlejuice sequel in 2024 is a bit like having Weekend at Bernie's Part 3 in 2024. One could say the moment has passed. But here it is. Can it possibly be any good, you ask? Well, yeah, actually, it's all right. It's not too bad. But before we get into that, let me just make a declaration about the original Beetlejuice, because it's important to contextualise this review for the slow of thought out there. I'm not a Beetlejuice mega fan. Until I rewatched it the other day in preparation for the sequel, I hadn't seen it probably in about 25, 30 years. It's not a movie I've returned to very often. As a kid, I found it a little bit, I mean, it was quirky and interesting, but nothing sort of stuck. It's not something that I felt I had to revisit constantly, and I had no desire to see a follow-up. None. Just so you know. I couldn't quote the original movie. The only sequence I can remember is the one everyone remembers, with him in the waiting room with the ticker now serving 997,000 in his hand. We all remember that joke, don't we? It's been turned into a GIF and it's on Twitter and all the rest of it. But other than that, Beetlejuice, what do we remember about it? Not much. And on viewing it again, one can understand why we don't remember much about it, because it really is a fairly superficial movie. It's full of lots of quirky visual humour and production design. It's got a real anarchic energy to it. But in terms of memorable dialogue, characters, story, there's nothing really there. It's a bawdy sketch comedy, a B movie with, that's very, very light touch as it goes through its very simple story of, good ghosts trying to get out the bad people who've occupied their dream home after they've died. It's Poltergeist flipped. And that's the joke, that's the conceit. And it's a movie built on a comic conceit. Tim Burton, who often said he didn't tell stories very well, and we've seen that's true subsequently. Batman had blockbuster architecture, if you like. It had storytelling scaffolding built in, so that, Burton couldn't screw up that story. But he did tell it with a certain, mechanical air to it. You could see the join, literally, in some places. It wasn't a slick telling of Sam Hamm's script, was it? He's more comfortable in fantasy, fairy tale territory, where you can pull back and be more abstract, and you don't have to deal with things like, the real world or psychological depth, interiority. That's not Tim Burton's forte. He's a man who's comfortable with oddball animation and, quirky characters and outre situations. But in that respect, he's more director of, burlesque sketches rather than a storyteller of note, I would argue. When he tries to tell a real story, I think that he gets into trouble. But with Beetlejuice, you could see how it suited him perfectly, because really it is just a series of visual gags held together very loosely by Michael Keaton's performance as the ghost with the most. He's not in it much. You forget that until you re-watch Beetlejuice, the 1988 film. There's not much of him, but there's not much of anything. It's only a 90-minute movie. They don't spend any time setting up the story, really. Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis are dead within the first 5 minutes, and then we're straight into it. So we haven't got time to know them or anything like that. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism, because like I said, it suits the style. It's a B movie. It's not supposed to be deep. It's not the kind of movie where you spend 25, 30 minutes setting the story up. Burton understood that. It's just, let's go straight into it. The couple are dead, and they're haunting their old house, and the new neighbours are effete, pretentious arseholes. I get it. That's all we need to know. So, it's in some respects, is it a movie of its time? I don't know, because there's a lot of old-fashioned influences informing Beetlejuice and so on. When you're re-watching the first movie, you're looking at Michael Keaton's character, who is an unashamed pervert and so on, and has got his mini whorehouse in the model village, and you think, would this get through? Would this get through in a modern comedy? Probably not. Which leads you to think, what are they going to do with Beetlejuice? Because the nightmare scenario going into Beetlejuice is that it's going to be the old movie with all of this modern nonsense that we've come to loathe in a lot of modern Hollywood films imposed on it. It's going to have conspicuous political propaganda. It's going to be about identity politics. The edges are going to be sanded down. It's going to be long without doing anything new. There's going to be lots of awful padding and terrible sentimentality and all the rest of it. Can movies be funny and trim and bawdy and maybe even offensive in the modern era? Well, many aren't, are they? Many modern movies are bland as butter and look corporatized to within an inch of their life. The good news, ladies and genitals, is that Beetlejuice does not feel like that. It's a completely congruous continuation of the first film. So much so, in fact, that if, Winona Ryder wasn't in her 50s, and Catherine O'Hara wasn't presumably in her 70s, or what have you, though they both look good for their age, it's perfectly possible to imagine that this movie being made a lot earlier. The title hammers home the fact that it is 2024 AD, in the Hammer sense, and that's fine. But the good news is if you watch Beetlejuice on Friday and you watch Beetlejuice on Saturday, you will notice a congruous tone, style, and the same kind of irreverent humour. There is no massive diversion between the two. They are of a piece with one another. That isn't to say that Beetlejuice gives you much that's new. Of course, it's patterned on the first film to a degree. It more develops little threads from the first movie. It pulls those threads. So instead of one head shrunk ghost, you've got an office full of them now. And, you know, there's more, the afterlife is explored in more detail, and, you know, to discover that it has an internal system of justice and all the rest of it. And there's a joke which is overdone but fine about Willem Dafoe being an actor who played a cop who in the afterlife is a cop, has become the part that he played in movies when he was alive. So, you know, he says, you know, got to keep it real. But of course, you know, the joke is that he just embodies a series of police procedural cliches. Fine. They do that joke to death, by the way. They overdo it, but it's not a bad joke, is it? But it isn't quite the same story again. There's not another couple who die at the beginning and find themselves being haunted, you know, by the living. Instead, it continues the story of Winona Ryder's family, and it even deals with the problematic Jeffrey Jones, who I believe was eventually outed as a sexual deviant. His punishment in this movie is to be, spoiler, killed off, eaten by a shark. But even here, in animation, no less, which is a nice touch, stop motion animation. But the nice touch is that he does reappear in the afterlife, but as a half-eaten man, you know, with the top half missing. And it's quite a good joke. And that's the story of Beetlejuice. There's lots of good humour in it. There's lots of the same bawdy humour from the original. It's a slight continuation or slight development of the first movie without being an evolution of the first film. This is not reinventing the wheel here. This is not a high risk diversion from what we had before. But were you really expecting that, to be fair? Given the tendency of legacy sequels, which this certainly is, to usually just tell the same story all over again, but with, you know, the child of the legacy character being central to the action. It is nice to see a legacy sequel where, yes, the legacy character has a daughter, and yes, they feature predominantly in the plot, but they're not just doing exactly the same things that their parents did a generation ago. They have a little thread, a little arc of their own. And credit to the writers and credit to Tim Burton. You know, stubbornly, he sticks with Winona Ryder as the object of Beetlejuice's affections. And there's a nice little joke in this about the age gap between them. You know, that was one of the elements of the first film that was self-consciously uncomfortable. The fact that Beetlejuice was, you know, this ghost was trying to marry this lecherous old man was trying to marry this teenage girl. Well, Winona Ryder gets a good gag in here about, you know, the fact that there's 600 years between them and therefore the age gap isn't appropriate and so on. That's a nice joke. It covers the original, you know, addresses the old elephant in the room, but in movie context that works. That's the story of the whole movie. There's a little bit, a fraction, a scintilla more plot in Beetlejuice than in Beetlejuice. Because, you know, the old family restoration subplot that adorns so many Hollywood blockbusters, ruins so many Hollywood blockbusters, is here. You know, rearing its ugly, shrunken head. And you wonder, is it going to overwhelm the movie? Is it going to take it over? Is it going to destroy it? Because they lay the foundations. Oh, my dad's dead, says General Taker. But, you know, my mother, who professes to see ghosts, can't see him. I want to see my dad again. My dead dad. But, spoilers, yes, he comes back. But he comes back in the afterlife with the fish, the piranha fish that ate him in the Amazon or whatever, still attached, still eating him. That's a good joke. That's funny. There's a joke with a dead cat lady whose cats obviously ate her. And the cats are in the afterlife with her, still chewing away, you know. And that's more, you know, shall we say, dark humour than you normally get in a mainstream studio comedy these days. It is absolutely a Tim Burton movie. It's a Tim Burton movie without being a self-parody of a Tim Burton movie. Every time the story threatens to come to the fore and take out the film over, Burton pulls back and remembers it's a Beetlejuice sequel, and we get a bit of zany humour instead. So it never becomes sentimental, it never becomes trite. These people are never in any danger of becoming real people. Thank God. Because if they suddenly were real people, that it would be weird, wouldn't it? Because they certainly weren't in the first movie. So the present day does get a look in, right? But then in 1988, you know, there was talk of yuppies and so on. In this movie, there's talk of safe spaces and climate change. But it's not it's not, you know, obnoxiously done. It's simply there, to be a sign of the times, to mark our card that 30 years have passed. It never becomes a theme in the movie. It never takes it over. Beetlejuice is still a pervert. He's still crude. He's still, you know, unpleasant. He's still a force of nature. Michael Keaton reprises the role effortlessly, really. Voice might be a bit more husky than it used to be, but again, half the time you wouldn't know that so much time had passed, and that's to the movie's credit also. It doesn't all work. Like I said, there is a little bit more going on in this sequel than there was in the original movie. More of an attempt to tell a very light touch story. And there are several plot elements in this movie that make it a little bit choppy. And occasionally you think, is this going to derail the whole thing? But again, fortunately, it doesn't, because Burton pulls back and he doesn't let the various elements of the story, like Beetlejuice's former lover, the lover that made him a ghost in the first place, that doesn't overwhelm the story, fortunately. It's just a live element, and eventually all the threads are bunched, as you would hope they would be. So that's it, really. It's pretty amusing without being riotously funny. It's visually interesting without being any departure or evolution of the original film. There's plenty of callbacks, but Not so many that you think that this is just a derivative exercise. It feels like a perfectly legitimate part 2. Maybe not, a part 2 that in any way enhances the first movie, but it certainly doesn't retrospectively ruin it either. They can sit perfectly comfortably together. And I, for one, just for one, found Beetlejuice Beetlejuice to be a perfectly enjoyable experience. It's probably the best thing that Tim Burton has done in about 15 years, which, when you think back to the likes of Alice in Wonderland and all the rest of it, might not sound like a lot, but isn't it nice to see Tim Burton back to where he started, in the sense that he's just having a lot of irreverent fun, which is enhanced by his own unique sort of visual sensibility and his good sense of the absurd. He looks like a man who has relaxed and resigned himself to the fact that his best work was maybe his silliest work. And here he is revisiting that territory. And he picks it up, it has to be said, pretty effortlessly. So, that's it. Beetlejuice Beetlejuice is certified 12A. For one instance of the word fuck, you only get one in a 12A. The second instance is beeped out ridiculously, but that's how our insane certification system works. Until next time, I'm Dr. Macclevoid. That's not my real name. Fuck you.